The text came on a Wednesday morning. Gray light through half-closed blinds, 1 bar of signal left, and a phone bill I couldn't pay. Are you Michael? You've been left $47 million. I thought it was a scam. Another cruel joke the universe had queued up after my divorce. 2 weeks earlier, I'd been sleeping in my car behind a closed gas station, eating stale crackers from a glove compartment, the kind my ex used to throw away when they expired. Now someone was claiming I'd been left millions, as if money could just appear out of thin air for a man who couldn't even afford a shower. I didn't reply. But then the second message came. We need to confirm your identity before the estate transfers. The executor's office has been trying to reach you for days. That word, an estate, hit differently. It sounded real. It sounded documented. It sounded like the kind of word people used in rooms I used to dream about being invited into. I didn't answer the text right away. The phone sat in my palm for almost an hour, while condensation fogged the windshield. My breath made little clouds in the cold, and I traced circles on the glass, pretending to think about something else. But the truth was, I had nowhere to be and nothing left to lose. Divorce court had cleaned me out. My ex-wife Rachel got the house, the Subaru, and our dog Baxter. I got the storage unit and a mountain of legal fees that looked like coordinates to nowhere. $372,000 in shared debt. A signature I'd stupidly added to her loan refinance, and a lawyer who said, Michael, the court tends to favor stability. She has the home, the job, the child. Stability. That word had crushed me more than the verdict. I wasn't stable. I was disposable. When I left the courthouse, I didn't even take my tie off. I just kept walking until I reached the river. I stood there for hours watching cargo ships crawl by like time itself refusing to stop. A week later, I sold my watch for $60 and filled the tank of my car. The last real thing I owned. That was home now, a 2008 Corolla with peeling tint and 1 working window. Every night I'd park near the old industrial lots because no one asked questions there. Just men with the same quiet look of failure, eyes fixed on their dashboards. One of them, a guy named Luis, once told me, when the system forgets you, it's easier to disappear than to fight. I believed him. That morning, the second message still glowed on the cracked screen. Executor's office. Confirm identity. My thumb hovered above the reply button. Curiosity won. I typed back, who left it? The answer came within minutes, Robert Talbot. The name didn't mean anything until I remembered the letter. It had been mailed to my parents' old address 2 months earlier, forwarded, then lost somewhere between post offices. My father's sister, Aunt Margaret, had mentioned a friend-in-law named Talbot decades ago. Something about property investments. I dismissed it then, but now that name felt like the only thread connecting me to something that wasn't broken. I drove to the nearest coffee shop with free Wi-Fi and plugged in my phone like it was a lifeline. There were 6 unread emails from an address ending in talbotandgraylaw.com. The subject line said, Urgent, Estate Beneficiary Confirmation. Each one more polite than the last. I opened the first half expecting ransomware. Instead, there was a scanned letterhead, embossed seal, and the line that froze me. The late Mr. Robert H. Talbot listed you, Michael Grant, as a residual beneficiary under Article 3 of his will. For the first time in months, I felt my pulse steady. A real name, a real document, a real number. But why me? I never knew a Robert Talbot. I reread the date of death, February 9th, 1 day after Rachel had filed the final divorce papers. My first thought was superstition. My second was survival. If this was real, it could change everything. But I'd been fooled before. Scams wore suits these days. Still, something about the typography, the precision of the legal language made it impossible to ignore. The email ended with a phone number. I called. The voice on the other end was calm, older, confident. Mr. Grant, thank you for returning our messages. I was beginning to think we had the wrong Michael. You probably do, I said. I don't know any Robert Talbot, he chuckled. That's what makes this interesting. Mr. Talbot mentioned you in his will by full name and birth date. You're not related, but you were recommended. Recommended by who? I can't disclose that yet. Not until you signed the initial verification forms. It sounded like a trap, but the tone wasn't the greasy kind of salesman smooth. It was measured, procedural, and for once someone spoke to me like I wasn't a burden. The man introduced himself as Attorney Daniel Price from Talbot and Gray Estate Division. He asked if I could come to their downtown office. I told him I didn't even have an address to list on the forms. There was a long pause, then he said quietly, "That's fine, Mr. Grant, just bring identification. We'll handle the rest." 2 hours later, I was sitting in a lobby that smelled of lemon polish and quiet money. The receptionist offered me coffee I was too nervous to drink. I must have looked out of place. Tattered jacket, 5-day stubble, shoes that had forgotten shine. Price emerged from a glass door and shook my hand like I mattered. "You look tired," he said, not unkindly. "Rough few months?" "Rough few years," he nodded. "Then let's see if Mr. Talbot can make them a little less rough." He led me into a conference room where everything gleamed. Wood, glass, steel, success. He slid a file across the table. Inside were printed bank statements, property deeds, and a last will and testament. At the bottom, my name. Residual beneficiary, Michael Grant. I stared at the signature and seal. My voice cracked. "Is this a joke?" Price folded his hands. "No joke. But it's not as simple as it looks. There are conditions." I leaned back, heart pounding. "Of course there are. Mr. Talbot's estate is sizable, 47 million give or take. But before any distribution, there's an audit. You were named as a secondary heir, contingent upon completion of what he called a restitution clause." "What does that mean?" "It means you'll have to correct a wrong that was done. By someone else, but connected to you." The room went silent except for the faint hum of the air vent. I didn't understand it yet, but that sentence would change everything. Price slid another folder toward me, thinner but heavier in meaning. Inside were scanned copies of property transfers, loan agreements, and notarized letters dating back nearly 15 years. The name Rachel Grant appeared on 3 of them, my ex-wife's signature, her maiden name scribbled beneath it, attached to accounts I had never seen. "She worked with him?" I asked quietly, trying to make sense of the neat looping pen strokes. Price adjusted his glasses. "Not exactly. According to the file, she was listed as a consultant for a company called Talgrow Ventures. Mr. Talbot was the primary investor." I blinked, the words sliding into place like puzzle pieces that had been there all along. Talgrow Ventures, the same side project Rachel used to mention when explaining her late nights. She'd said it was part of her marketing portfolio, nothing serious, just helping a client with branding. I never questioned it. Back then I was building my own small logistics firm, working 12-hour shifts, too tired to dig deeper. Price tapped a highlighted line near the bottom of a document. "This entry shows a transfer of $310,000 to a joint account, yours and hers, 2 years ago." "That can't be right," I said, leaning forward. "We never had that kind of money. It was moved the same week you refinanced your home." I felt my throat tighten. That refinance had haunted me, the one that wiped my credit and buried me under her debt. Now I understood why. Rachel had hidden the money, used the house as cover, and left my name attached to the fallout. And Talbot, the man now offering me a fortune and had been her silent partner. Price continued, his tone careful but probing. "Mr. Talbot was aware of the transaction. He left a note to the executor before his death. Ensure the grant file is closed properly. He deserves restitution. That's the clause." I sat back, every nerve humming. "So, she stole from him and he's paying me back for it?" Price nodded. "Essentially. But to process the clause, we need proof of your innocence. Bank statements, communication records, anything showing you were unaware of the funds. Most of that's gone. The divorce burned everything. Then we'll rebuild it. Mr. Talbot's records are detailed. If you cooperate, the transfer will proceed within 60 days. The number 60 rattled around in my head like a clock starting again. For the first time in years, there was a timeline that didn't end with eviction. That night, I parked the Corolla by the waterfront again, engine off, watching the city lights shimmer like things I used to believe in. My phone buzzed, a new email from Price, attachments labeled Phase 1 verification. I scrolled through the files until I saw the final note in Talbot's handwriting. One man's fall shouldn't be another's punishment. He was just collateral. I reread it 10 times. Someone had seen me. Someone had known what Rachel did and still chose to leave me a way out. For the first time, I felt something close to anger, not at her, but at myself for staying quiet so long. The next morning I called Price. "What happens if I find evidence she moved more than that $310,000? He paused. "Then restitution becomes litigation. And you'd be the plaintiff," I almost laughed. Me? I can't afford coffee and you're talking about lawsuits. Mr. Grant, if the clause activates, our firm represents you pro bono. That was Talbot's directive. I leaned back against the seat, staring through the cracked windshield at a sky that suddenly looked wider. All right, then let's begin. The following week felt like living inside a ledger. Price's assistant, a woman named Eleanor, sent me daily tasks, request statements, contact old clients, dig up tax records from a storage unit I'd nearly abandoned. Each night I returned to that car with new documents stacked on the passenger seat like proof I still existed. One evening, while sorting through receipts, I found something that made my hands go cold. An email printout dated 5 years back, forwarded to Rachel from her personal account. Subject: Talgro Q1 report. M. Grant signature needed. Attached was my scanned signature. I never signed it. The document was a personal guarantee for a $200,000 loan drawn in both our names. It explained everything: the refinance, the missing funds, even the credit collapse. I photographed every page and sent it to Price. 10 minutes later, he called. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is fraud." What followed was a blur of procedural momentum: affidavits, timestamps, digital forensics. Price moved like a man who'd been waiting for this day. Talbot suspected misappropriation years ago, he told me during one of our meetings. But he was dying. He couldn't pursue it. His instructions were clear. Once you're located and verified, the firm is to complete restitution and, if warranted, pursue recovery from the responsible party. In plain English, Rachel was about to face what she'd escaped. 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived at her new address. Price let me read it before it was sent. To Mrs. Rachel Carter, formerly Grant. This correspondence serves as notice of pending civil action regarding financial misconduct under accounts jointly held during your marriage to Mr. Michael Grant. The language was precise, surgical. No emotion, just consequence. The response came 3 days later. Not from her, but from her attorney. A curt email. Cease contact claims are unfounded. All marital accounts were settled. Price smiled when he read it. Textbook deflection. We'll subpoena the records. I didn't sleep that night. Memories replayed like interrogation footage. Her laughter when I'd ask about missing invoices. The way she'd say, "You worry too much about paperwork, Michael." I thought about all the nights I'd driven past our old house just to see the lights on, wondering if she ever felt guilt. Probably not. But she would soon. The first court hearing was set for late June. I walked in wearing a borrowed suit, shoulders tight but steady. Rachel was there, calm and polished, her lawyer whispering in her ear. She didn't even glance my way until Price stood to present evidence. When he projected the forged signature onto the courtroom screen, her composure cracked just slightly. A flicker of recognition, then denial. "I never," she started, but her lawyer cut her off. Price spoke evenly. "Your client authorized this document using Mr. Grant's digital credentials, which were accessed from her IP address on March 14, 2018. The server logs confirm it." Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Carter, did you sign this?" Silence. Then the smallest nod. By the end of the hearing, the court froze her assets pending review. Price didn't gloat. He simply gathered the papers, turned to me, and said, "We're halfway there." That night, sitting by the river again, I finally allowed myself to feel something close to peace. The same water that once looked like an escape now looked like reflection. I wasn't drowning anymore. I was resurfacing. 3 weeks later, the city courthouse smelled of rain and tension. Reporters hovered near the entrance because someone had leaked the story. Local entrepreneur faces fraud investigation tied to late investor's estate. Rachel walked in through a side door wearing a beige suit and dark glasses like she was starring in Damage Control. I stood by the window, arms crossed, pretending not to watch. Price spoke first, submitting the audit summary and a motion to transfer all seized assets into a holding trust pending distribution. Every number was a wound reopened. The refinance, the forged guarantees, the consulting payments to Talgro. When the judge asked if I wished to make a statement, I said only one line. I trusted her with my signature. It hung in the air long enough for her to flinch. Price handled the rest. He moved like a man dissecting a lie, one comma at a time. The ruling came before noon. Preliminary restitution approved, assets frozen, motion for civil recovery granted. The words didn't feel real until the clerk stamped the seal and handed me a copy. For the first time since the divorce, I owned something with my name cleanly printed on it. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the streets still shone. Price buttoned his coat and said quietly, "You'll need to open a temporary account. The transfer will begin within 48 hours. I nodded, half expecting someone to wake me up before it cleared. He looked at me the way bankers look at ledgers. "What will you do when it's done?" I shrugged. "Maybe breathe." That night I drove back to the waterfront but couldn't bring myself to park in the usual spot. The car felt too small for what was coming. I slept in a motel for the first time in months and woke up to an email from Eleanor. Phase 2 initiated, trustee appointment scheduled. Attached was a scanned letter signed by the executors board. It listed a preliminary figure, $47,213,847. Every cent documented, accounted, and waiting. The next days moved like the aftermath of a storm. My phone filled with calls from unknown numbers, journalists, law firms, relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly remembering birthdays. Even my old employer reached out asking if I'd consider consulting. I ignored most of them. Money changes the grammar of how people talk to you. Price kept me anchored. "Don't celebrate yet," he said during one meeting. "She's appealing. And she's angry." The appeal didn't last long. The evidence was too clean, too digital. Within a month, Rachel signed a settlement agreement under court supervision. Her properties were liquidated to cover partial restitution. It wasn't revenge. It was arithmetic. The math finally balanced. 2 months later, the trust finalized the transfer. I didn't touch the money right away. I just watched the numbers appear on the bank screen like coordinates to a new planet. $47 million. And not a single person I could call to share it with. That irony hit harder than poverty ever did. I rented a small apartment downtown, furnished it with one table, one chair, and silence. Every sound echoed. One evening, Price visited with a brown envelope. "Last file," he said. "Mr. Talbot left you something personal." Inside was a letter handwritten in tight blue ink. "Michael," it began, "you don't know me, but I knew your father. He helped me once when no one else would. He told me about his son who believed in fair deals. That's why your name is here. Keep the money if you wish, but use it to build something clean." I sat there for a long time reading those words until they blurred. My father had died years ago, quietly, modestly, and I had spent years thinking I'd inherited nothing. Now I understood this wasn't charity. It was closure, but the world doesn't stay quiet for long. The story leaked again, this time with photos. Homeless divorcee inherits fortune through mystery benefactor. They loved the irony. Cameras waited outside my building for a week. I stopped answering the door. People began sending letters, pleas for help, threats, marriage proposals. One envelope caught my eye because it was handwritten like Talbot's. Inside was a single note from Rachel. "You've won. Are you happy now?" I read it once, folded it neatly, and dropped it in the trash. Happiness wasn't part of the equation anymore. When the settlement finally closed, Price transferred the remaining estate balance into my name. He handed me the final document, shook my hand, and said, "Mr. Grant, you're a wealthy man now." I looked at the paper and then at him. "No, I'm just a man who finally broke even." That night I walked to the river again. Same water, same reflection, different man. The city lights didn't mock me anymore. They just shimmered, waiting. I thought about everything Talbot had written, about restitution, about fairness. So I opened my laptop and filed for a new company name, Talbot Grant Foundation. Its mission line was simple: legal aid for men who lost everything in divorce and fraud. Not revenge, just balance. I never saw Rachel again, though I heard she moved west, changed her name, started a consulting firm no one trusts. Price sends me updates sometimes, small wins, grants approved, lives patched back together. Every time I sign a check, I remember that signature she stole. I reclaim it stroke by stroke. And when people ask how it feels to go from homeless to millionaire overnight, I tell them the truth. Money didn't save me. Accountability did. I spent the next few months trying to learn how to exist again, not as a headline or a cautionary tale, but as a person who could wake up without checking court updates. My apartment overlooked the financial district, glass and concrete pretending to be stability. Every morning I'd sit by the window with black coffee and scroll through emails from accountants, fund managers, and journalists trying to profile the man who inherited $47 million. I ignored them all. I wasn't interested in redemption arcs for magazines, but the noise found its way in. Someone from a talk show offered me $50,000 for an interview. Another suggested a book deal. Price advised against both. Mystery protects value, he said, meaning both financial and emotional. I listened. Silence was my new investment. Still, wealth attracts gravity. People started orbiting again. Old coworkers, distant cousins, even strangers who claimed to have known my father. They wanted partnerships, donations, mentorship. I gave none. I remembered what it felt like to have everyone vanish when I was broke. Now they returned with polished smiles. One afternoon a letter arrived, no return address. Inside was a single line typed on yellow paper. She's telling people it was your scam. I didn't need to guess who she was. Rachel's version had always been louder. I called Price, he sighed. We anticipated that. She's trying to frame the restitution as collusion. We'll handle it. But that night something in me shifted. The idea that after everything, court rulings, evidence, restitution, she still saw herself as the victim, made me realize revenge wasn't over. It had just changed shape. It wasn't about humiliation anymore. It was about narrative control. She'd written the story where I was a con man. Now I'd write the truth in ink she couldn't erase. I began documenting everything. Every statement, timestamp, affidavit, and legal record. I turned it into a single cohesive file. A digital dossier that told the story from start to finish. No commentary, no embellishment. Just receipts. Then one quiet Sunday, I uploaded it anonymously to a public records forum used by investigative journalists. Not tabloids. Real reporters, the kind who checked facts before printing them. Within a week, an article appeared titled, "The Grant Case, How a Divorce Fraud Unraveled into a $47 million Restitution." It didn't mention me directly, but laid out the timeline. The forged documents, the audits, the clause. Every word was true. The comments section exploded with arguments. Some called me lucky, others said it was karma. I didn't care. The truth was archived. That was enough, but Rachel cared. She broke silence with a furious post on social media accusing certain individuals of exploiting her grief, claiming she'd been targeted by powerful men. The irony of painting herself as prey after years of manipulation almost made me laugh. Almost. Price called again. Ignore it, he said. Public opinion burns out faster than facts. He was right. Within a month, the noise died down. She deleted the post. I learned something that day. Justice doesn't need applause, it needs endurance. I started spending time in the library downtown, the same one I'd used years ago when I couldn't afford Wi-Fi. I'd sit there surrounded by the sound of pages turning and realize that peace isn't silence. It's relevance without chaos. That's where I began planning the foundation. It started as a spreadsheet. Cases of men who'd been bankrupted by fraudulent partnerships, coerced debts, or hidden assets. I reached out to small legal aid offices, offering anonymous funding for audits and appeals. The first success came 3 months later. A man named Carter from Ohio recovered $180,000 after proving his ex-business partner had falsified invoices. He sent a letter. "You gave me back my name." That line stayed with me. It was what Talbot had done for me. It was what I wanted to keep doing. Meanwhile, my past tried to re-enter. Rachel's attorney proposed mediation, a quiet settlement to avoid further reputational harm. I told Price to reject it. She wanted me to withdraw the public documentation in exchange for silence. I didn't want silence anymore. I wanted the record. Every forged document she signed stayed archived. When her appeal finally failed, she was ordered to repay an additional $600,000 in damages. The court report used one phrase that felt like oxygen. Intentional deception with calculated concealment. I printed that page and kept it folded in my wallet. Proof that truth could be measured in ink. But even victory has a strange aftertaste. Nights grew long again, not with fear, but with restlessness. I'd lie awake listening to city sounds and think about how easy it is to lose yourself inside the machinery of money. I had everything I once begged for and nothing familiar left. No friends from before, no family to share it with. My father's name had resurfaced in Talbot's letter, but his side of the family was gone. I drove to his old hometown once just to stand outside the house where he'd grown up. A woman answered the door, kind-faced, maybe 70. "You knew Robert Talbot?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "He was your father's friend. Helped build the shelter down by the docks." "Why?" "He left me something," I said. Then he meant it. She smiled. He always said your dad was the only man who never asked him for anything back. That line hit harder than any verdict. My father had believed in quiet fairness and debts paid forward. That was the real inheritance. The money was just proof someone remembered. On the drive back, I made a decision. Half of the estate's interest would go to funding housing projects for men in transition, divorcees, veterans, laid-off workers, anyone who'd been told stability was gone. I wanted to rebuild the system that had once written me off. Price thought it was reckless. You'll cut your holdings in half, he said. I'll double my piece, I answered. He smiled. Then I'll make it legal. Months turned into a year. The foundation gained traction. Journalists who once chased gossip now covered case studies. I stayed in the background, anonymous in plain sight. I didn't crave spotlight. I craved efficiency. One morning, Eleanor called. You've been nominated for a Civic Restoration Award, she said. I laughed. They give awards for paying debts now? No, she said, for proving they can be repaid differently. I didn't attend the ceremony. Instead, I went to the river. Same bench, same skyline. The water moved slow, heavy with memory. I dropped a copy of Talbot's letter into the current and watched it drift away. It wasn't about letting go, it was about circulation. Then, just when I thought the story had settled, another message arrived. Different number, same simplicity. Are you Michael? I represent the estate of Catherine H. Talbot. We need to discuss an addendum. For a moment I froze, thinking it was a scam. But attached was a PDF, an official probate document with the same seal as before. Catherine Talbot, Robert's widow, had passed away and left a final request. For Mr. Michael Grant to serve as executor to finalize charitable distributions. It meant she trusted me with what remained, over $12 million earmarked for education and rehabilitation programs. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Full circle, I thought. The man I'd never met had handed me a chance to rebuild my life, and now his family was handing me the legacy of his. That night, I drafted my acceptance letter. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about weight, the kind you earn by carrying something correctly. I walked to the window, city lights stretching like equations across the river, and whispered the line that had lived with me since the first message. Are you Michael? Yes, I am, and for the first time, I knew exactly what that meant. The day I formally became executor, the office conference room looked exactly as it had the first time I'd stepped inside it. A long table, silent clocks, the smell of printer ink and lemon polish. Price stood beside me while the board read through the protocol. Every line I initialed felt heavier than the last. Signatures weren't just ink now. They were inheritance turned into responsibility. The board's chair, an older woman named Dr. Winslow, said, You understand, Mr. Grant, that you are now the legal custodian of the Talbot Trust. Disbursements require dual authorization. I nodded. Good, she said. Because in philanthropy, good men don't need supervision, but they do need procedure. That sentence stayed with me long after the meeting ended. It was discipline disguised as wisdom. Over the next year, the foundation expanded faster than I'd anticipated. We partnered with housing projects, legal aid clinics, small-town rehabilitation centers. The accounts were clean, transparent. Every quarter, Price's team published reports open to the public. No glamour, no press events, just numbers and outcomes. The same precision that had once destroyed me now rebuilt others. I started visiting sites quietly, unannounced, sitting in the back of community meetings while men told stories that sounded uncomfortably like mine. Bankruptcies, betrayals, custody battles, homelessness. One man, a carpenter named Sean, stood up and said, They say you find God at rock bottom. I found paperwork. Everyone laughed, but I knew what he meant. Paperwork is truth. It doesn't care who cries harder, only who signs correctly. My personal life, though, remained mostly empty. I dated once or twice, both times with women who'd Googled me first. They spoke in cautious admiration, like I was a museum exhibit of resilience. I ended both dinners early. The truth was, I'd learned to live on low noise. Love, like money, had become something you audit before trusting. I spent nights reading case law instead of watching movies. The habit of survival had become the ritual of order. I didn't hate it. I respected it. Then in the spring, Rachel resurfaced in the most predictable way possible, a subpoena. Her new attorney was trying to reopen the restitution case, claiming emotional distress and reputational defamation. Price called me, his tone dry. It's a Hail Mary motion. She's broke. Wants negotiation leverage. I told him to proceed by the book. We didn't fight fire with heat anymore, we fought it with paper. The hearing was brief. The judge dismissed it in less than 20 minutes, citing prior settlements and signed waivers. When it ended, Rachel approached me in the hallway, eyes hollow. You got everything, she said. Was it worth it? I looked at her for a long time before answering. It wasn't about getting everything. It was about ending the math. She didn't understand. She never had. She turned away, heels clicking like punctuation marks to a story that had already closed. I didn't watch her leave. I'd already filed her under resolved. Summer brought invitations to conferences, awards, televised panels on modern restitution and restorative justice. I declined them all. The more people tried to turn the story into inspiration, the more I wanted to remind them it was caution. Wealth earned through loss isn't victory, it's evidence. You don't celebrate evidence. You archive it. Still, one event caught my attention. A university contacted me about funding a legal ethics course in Robert Talbot's name. The proposal outlined a program that would train young attorneys in post-fraud recovery and ethical estate management. It felt right. I approved a $2 million endowment and requested one condition, that the first lecture each semester open with a single slide. The scanned phrase from Talbot's note, "One man's fall shouldn't be another's punishment." The dean agreed instantly. A month later, the course launched. Students wrote me letters describing how it changed their perception of justice. One wrote, "Your story made law human." I didn't reply. The story wasn't about me. It was about structure. Around that time, I began keeping a journal again. Not the kind filled with feelings, but observations, fragments, quiet notes. I wrote about light on windows, the sound of staplers in quiet offices, the way people breathe before signing something irreversible. It became a form of meditation. I realized that bureaucracy, when used with honesty, is its own form of poetry. Then came another unexpected turn. The Talbot Trust received a posthumous claim from a corporate entity in Switzerland. Apparently an old investment Talbot had made decades earlier that matured after his death. The sum was staggering, an additional $14 million. Legally, it belonged to the foundation, but there was a clause requiring an on-site audit before transfer. Price, ever the strategist, said, "You should go in person. It's what Talbot would have done." So I flew to Zurich. The city felt like precision carved into stone. Everything punctual, everything exact. I met with the Swiss accountants in a glass building overlooking the lake. They confirmed the fund's authenticity and released the records. Among them was a folder labeled Personal Correspondence, U.S. Beneficiary. Inside were 2 letters. One was from Talbot to his wife, dated before my father died. The second was from my father to Talbot, written years earlier, thanking him for helping a stubborn man keep his word. Reading it, I finally understood the full circle. My father had saved Talbot from bankruptcy once quietly without ever telling us. And Talbot had spent the rest of his life repaying that debt forward, to me. I walked out of the office into cold alpine air and sat on a bench overlooking the water. People passed by with briefcases, unaware that somewhere beneath all their spreadsheets and signatures lived a thread connecting debt, trust, and gratitude. I texted Price one line, "Transfer complete." It was his way of saying thank you. When I returned to the States, I rewrote the foundation's charter. The first line now read, "Every restitution is a relay. What's passed forward isn't money, it's correction." That became our motto. The foundation doubled in scale within a year, not because of publicity, but because truth had a strange gravity. It pulled survivors toward it. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel the emptiness growing alongside it. Success builds silence. The more I repaired the world around me, the less there was to fix inside. I tried volunteering at shelters, mentoring at clinics, but people looked at me differently now. Half myth, half investor. I missed being invisible. Sometimes I'd drive back to the same gas station where I used to sleep, park at the edge of the lot, and just watch the neon flicker. The attendant had changed. The pumps were digital now, but the smell of diesel and asphalt hadn't moved. I'd sit there for hours, remembering the man who'd stared at his phone that morning and decided to answer a stranger's text. Everything since then had unfolded from that one small act of curiosity. It made me wonder how many other lives turn on decisions that quiet. On the anniversary of the first message, I sent Price a note. No more inheritances, right? He replied instantly, no promises. I laughed, for real this time. The following winter arrived like an accountant, cold, deliberate, all columns and consequences. Snow layered the city in quiet arithmetic. Everything was measured, nothing extravagant. The foundation had become an organism by then, breathing without my constant supervision. Eleanor ran operations, Price oversaw legal, and I became something between a ghost and a curator. I read reports, signed documents, visited sites when no one was watching. That anonymity felt cleaner than applause. The press occasionally tried to resurrect my story, spinning it into the homeless millionaire, the accidental philanthropist, the man who turned revenge into restitution. But I refused interviews. Words age badly when you let the wrong people hold the pen. My revenge had already been written. It existed in every ledger balanced and every case restored. Anything else was noise. Still, the quiet had weight. My apartment, minimalist by design, began to feel like an archive of one man's overcorrection. No photographs, no art, just paperwork and sterile order. I didn't realize how isolated I'd become until one night the power went out during a snowstorm, and the sudden silence made me realize how long it had been since I'd heard another voice indoors. I lit a candle, poured a drink, and sat by the window, watching the city dissolve into static white. Somewhere below, sirens faded. For the first time, I asked myself what I was actually building all this for. I had restored my name, my balance sheet, my father's legacy, but not a life. Money cleans the surface. It doesn't fix the foundation underneath. A few weeks later, Eleanor called about a case that stopped me cold. It's a small-town claim, she said. Widower, early 60s. His wife's name is Catherine Grant. I froze. No relation? I asked. Probably not, she said. But he sent a handwritten note with his application. He says he knew your father. I asked her to scan it. When the email came through, I opened the attachment and there it was. Shaky penmanship, faded ink, and my father's name written in a line of gratitude from decades ago. The man claimed to have worked with him at a construction site during the 70s. Said my father once covered his medical bills when a scaffolding accident left him unable to work. He told me back then, the letter read, that debt should always travel forward, never backward. You seem to believe the same thing. I stared at that page until my eyes burned. Maybe this was how justice actually moved. Quietly, through generations like compound interest and decency. I decided to visit the man. His name was Harold. He lived 3 hours north in a small town that still used handwritten receipts. The road there was narrow, winding through pine forests and old mining hills. When I arrived, Harold was sitting on his porch wrapped in a wool blanket, oxygen tank hissing softly beside him. He recognized me immediately. You're his boy, he said. You've got his eyes. Serious eyes. Always looking for the clean line. We talked for hours about my father, about Talbot, about debt that wasn't measured in dollars. When I told him the foundation would cover his mortgage and medical bills, he shook his head. I didn't write you for help, he said. I just wanted you to know your old man wasn't forgotten. I drove back in silence, the weight of inheritance turning from money into memory. Back in the city, I found myself slowing down. Meetings that once felt urgent now felt mechanical. I started taking the subway again, sitting among strangers just to hear conversations that didn't involve lawsuits or endowments. The sound of people arguing over groceries felt almost sacred, proof of normal life. One evening, I overheard a young couple debating whether to buy a Christmas tree or save the money for bills. The man laughed and said, "Maybe someone will leave us $47 million. I smiled, unseen. If only he knew how little that number mattered once the noise faded. Then came an invitation I couldn't ignore. The university that had named its ethics course after Talbot was hosting a memorial symposium. They wanted me to deliver the keynote speech, The Future of Restorative Wealth. I nearly declined, but something in me whispered that it was time to speak, just once, on my own terms. The lecture hall was packed. Students, journalists, professors, even a few lawyers from the early hearings. I stood at the podium without notes, just the memory of that first text message still glowing in my mind like an ember that refused to die. I was a man who lost everything, I began. And then I received a message that sounded like a scam, but turned out to be a correction. What I've learned since is that money doesn't save anyone. It only exposes what they already are. If you were small before, wealth makes you smaller. If you were decent, it gives you room to prove it. The hardest part of justice isn't getting even, it's staying equal. The room was so quiet you could hear the microphones hum. When I finished, no one clapped for a few seconds. Then they did. Slow, rising, real. I left before anyone could corner me. The next morning, my inbox flooded with requests. Talks, interviews, partnerships. I ignored them all except one. An email from a journalist named Naomi Keller. She'd written the first serious article about my case years earlier, the one that stayed factual while everyone else sensationalized. Her message was brief. I'm writing a book about restitution. I'd like to talk, not as an interview, but as two people who survived systems. I agreed. We met in a small cafe by the river. She looked older, softer around the eyes. We talked for 3 hours about everything except money, about exhaustion, about loss, about how winning can feel like another kind of imprisonment. When we finally stood to leave, she said, you could let someone else hold some of the weight now. I didn't know how to answer. But the sentence lingered. Over the next months, we kept meeting. Dinners turned into walks, walks into weekends, weekends into quiet mornings where coffee replaced paperwork. I didn't plan for it. I just stopped resisting it. For the first time in years, someone looked at me without calculation. She didn't care about the fortune or the foundation. She cared about the man who'd once lived in a car and still folded his receipts in perfect lines. She told me once, "You confuse order with safety." She was right. But slowly, she made me see that the two didn't have to be enemies. The foundation continued to grow, but I stopped hiding behind it. Naomi encouraged me to write my story, not as confession, but as a manual. "Call it the balance sheet," she said. I laughed, but the title stuck. I spent months drafting chapters, each one named after a financial term that doubled as a moral equation. Assets, what you keep when everything's gone. Liabilities, the people you let stay too long. Interest, the cost of looking back. It became less a book about money and more a map of consequence. By the time it was finished, I realized I'd reached something I hadn't felt since before Rachel, before Talbot, before the courthouse. Peace, not loud, not cinematic, just functional, like a ledger that finally reconciled. The first warning came from Price late one afternoon when the light in his office turned copper against the glass. "You might want to sit down for this," he said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were court documents stamped from another state, Nevada. A class action suit had been filed against Talgrow Ventures, the old shell company Rachel once used. The plaintiffs were investors who claimed they'd been defrauded by a consultant who disappeared years earlier. Her name was on the front page, Rachel Carter, formerly Grant. My stomach turned, not from surprise but from the inevitability of it. Price continued. "They're alleging that part of the money she siphoned originated from Mr. Talbot's accounts. Because of your connection to both parties, they might subpoena you as a witness." I leaned back in the chair, eyes tracing the faint dust lines on the ceiling. "So it's back," I said quietly. "The loop never ends." He shook his head. "It ends differently this time. You're not the defendant anymore. You're the precedent." That line landed harder than he intended. When the subpoena arrived, I didn't fight it. I flew to Reno for the hearing, the first time I'd set foot in a courthouse since everything had unraveled. The courtroom was small, utilitarian, fluorescent. Rachel sat at the defense table, flanked by two attorneys who looked like they'd lost before they started. She glanced at me once, and for a moment the old reflexes came back. The memory of shared mortgages, of mornings spent arguing over invoices. But it felt distant, like remembering a language I no longer spoke. When I took the stand, the opposing counsel asked about my involvement with Talgrow, about the restitution, about Talbot. I answered every question with the precision of a man who'd already lived his cross-examination 100 times in dreams. When it ended, the judge thanked me for my clarity. Rachel's lawyer requested a recess. She looked like she wanted to say something, but I walked past her without stopping. I wasn't angry. Anger was a currency I'd stopped spending. Outside the courthouse, Naomi was waiting. She'd flown in quietly against my protests. "You didn't think I'd let you face her alone, did you?" she said. We sat on the courthouse steps while the desert wind rolled dust across the parking lot. "It's strange," I said, "seeing her like that. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like watching a rerun of someone else's mistake." Naomi touched my hand, her voice steady. "That's because it's no longer your story to finish. The verdict came 2 months later. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud. Sentencing pending. I didn't attend. Price sent me a summary instead. Her plea deal, the restitution order, the prohibition from financial consulting for life. The cycle had finally closed. Still, that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the last time Rachel had spoken to me. Was it worth it? Back then I hadn't answered. Now I could. It wasn't about worth. It was about weight. Carry it correctly and it becomes purpose. Drop it and it crushes you. Spring came early that year. The city thawed into motion again. People rushing, taxes due, sunlight bouncing off the mirrored towers like currency. The foundation opened a new office in Detroit, another in Phoenix. I traveled to both, mostly to ensure the book stayed honest. At night, I'd walk through neighborhoods that had once collapsed under debt and watch families move into renovated homes funded by Talbot grants. It was the quietest kind of revenge imaginable, repairing what greed had broken. Sometimes I'd see fathers teaching kids to ride bikes on streets where I once would have slept in my car. The sound of those training wheels scraping asphalt felt like absolution. Back in New York, Naomi and I settled into a rhythm. We shared the apartment now, though she insisted on keeping her own desk, her own quiet. She was still working on her book, Restitution, The Cost of Getting Even. Occasionally, she'd read me drafts over coffee, lines that cut closer than she realized. One night she read aloud, "Justice is arithmetic, but closure is language. You can't balance emotion the way you balance a ledger." I told her she should keep that line as the opening. She smiled. "It's yours, actually. You said it months ago." I hadn't remembered. That's how peace creeps in. It erases authorship. Then one morning, something unexpected arrived in the mail. A small brown envelope postmarked from Nevada. No return address. Inside was a photograph, old and slightly bent at the corners. Rachel and I standing in front of our first house, arms around each other, grinning like two people who believed in permanence. On the back, she'd written only 3 words. I was wrong. I stared at it for a long time. No anger, no satisfaction. Just recognition that some debts can only be acknowledged, never collected. I slipped the photo into a file labeled Archive of Closed Accounts and placed it in the safe. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was finality. Months passed. The foundation celebrated its 5th year. We hosted a small dinner, donors, lawyers, beneficiaries. I kept my speech short. We were all at some point someone else's collateral. Tonight we proved that collateral can become capital again. Applause came, soft and sincere. Afterward, Naomi and I walked home through the city. She asked, "Do you ever think about what you'd do if that text never came?" I thought for a moment. "Probably still be in that car," I said. Still checking mirrors, still hoping someone believed my side of the story. She smiled. Then maybe belief was the inheritance all along. That night, as she slept, I opened my laptop to review the quarterly audit, but instead found myself drafting a letter addressed to the Talbot Family Trust. To the heirs of Robert and Catherine Talbot, I've completed the duties assigned. The foundation is solvent, self-sustaining, and expanding. The mission continues, not in your name or mine, but in the names of those who never get second chances. If you seek repayment, consider it paid in full with interest. I signed it simply, Michael Grant, Executor Emeritus. It wasn't resignation. It was closure by documentation. When dawn came, I stood at the window watching the sun rise over the skyline. The city looked almost merciful at that hour. Buildings turning gold, traffic muted. My reflection in the glass looked older, calmer. There was a scar near my temple from years ago I'd never noticed before. It didn't bother me. Scars are just the body's way of keeping receipts. I poured coffee, sat down, and opened a new file titled Final Statement. I began to write not for the courts, not for the press, but for whoever might find it decades later when the names fade and only patterns remain. Justice isn't vengeance and restitution isn't grace. They're both forms of accounting, ways to make the world balance long enough for someone else to keep walking. I wrote until the room filled with light and the clock on the wall hit noon. Then I closed the file, saved it, and finally let myself exhale. Years blurred after that. Years not counted in income statements or headlines, but in seasons of quiet usefulness. The Talbot Grant Foundation became its own institution, no longer tethered to my name. Younger directors replaced me one by one. Price retired to Maine. Eleanor took over as chief counsel. I remained on the board only as a formality. My signature still carried weight, but it was ceremonial now, like a watermark on a faded document. Most days I spent in a small cabin near the Hudson, where the air smelled of pine and ink and the silence had texture. I kept no staff, no housekeeper, just a laptop, an old leather chair, and the same watch I'd pawned years ago and bought back at auction. I'd had it restored, but the faint scratch on the glass remained, a reminder that time doesn't forgive. It simply keeps moving. Sometimes I'd drive into the city for foundation meetings, watch the new generation of lawyers and analysts debate numbers I used to obsess over. They spoke about impact metrics, donor visibility, and cross-platform outreach, words that meant nothing when you're hungry and sleeping in your car. I'd smile quietly, listening to them quote me as if I were a textbook. Every restitution is a relay. Justice is arithmetic. They recited the lines like scripture, unaware that each one had been born from exhaustion, not wisdom. When meetings ended, I'd step outside and watch taxis hiss through rain and think how full circles don't make noise, they just close. Naomi's book became a bestseller. Restitution, the cost of getting, even found its way into classrooms, podcasts, documentaries. She never mentioned my name outright, only called me M. She said the anonymity was an act of preservation. We married quietly 2 years later. No ceremony, just a courthouse, 2 witnesses, and coffee after. She laughed when the clerk asked for our occupations. Writer, she said. I hesitated. Accountant, I answered. It wasn't a lie. I still kept ledgers, only now the accounts were moral, not financial. One winter evening we were invited to a televised panel about modern philanthropy. I refused, but Naomi went. I watched from home as she told the host, "People think restitution is about fixing what's broken. It's not. It's about proving that broken things can still have structure." That night I walked down to the river. Snow fell in slow diagonals, catching the light from the distant skyline. The water moved like old glass, heavy, imperfect, beautiful. I dropped a coin in, an old habit from when I used to wish for change instead of work for it. The ripples spread outward, erasing the reflection of the city for a few seconds before it returned sharper than before. A few months later, Price passed away in his sleep. The firm sent me his briefcase. Inside were my original case files, the ones he'd kept all these years. At the bottom was a note in his steady handwriting. "Closure isn't a verdict, it's maintenance. Keep maintaining." I placed the note beside Talbot's letter in the safe. 2 sentences that defined my life. Now I'm an old man with too many documents and not enough noise. The phone rarely rings. Sometimes Naomi reads to me from her next manuscript. Sometimes we just sit in the evening light, letting the silence balance itself. I don't miss the chaos. I don't miss the courtroom. I miss only the clarity, the sense that every action could still correct something. But maybe that's what age is. Realizing the ledger never really closes, it just changes accountants. A few weeks ago, the foundation held its 10th anniversary gala. I didn't attend, but they sent me a video. In it, a young woman took the stage, a beneficiary from one of our legal aid programs. She said, "Someone I've never met gave me the chance to stand here. They turned their loss into a system that saves people like me. I don't know his face, but I know his math." Then she smiled in that way only someone forgiven by circumstance can smile, lightly, fully, without performance. I turned off the screen and sat there a long time, realizing that maybe legacy isn't what survives you, but what no longer needs you to survive. Later that night, I opened my journal one last time. The page was nearly full, so I wrote small, slow, deliberate. If restitution was the lesson, then humility was the interest earned. Wealth was never the reward, it was the receipt. And revenge, in the end, was nothing more than a balanced account. I closed the book, placed it in the drawer, and watched the dawn seep through the curtains. Somewhere in the city, another man was probably waking up to a message that didn't make sense yet. Some chain reaction of fairness continuing without my name on it. I hoped he'd answer, and as I finish telling you this story, I have one question left. What would you have done if a single text could change not just your fortune, but the very meaning of justice itself?